Far too long, women have been typecast into the same few roles in movies. They tend to be minor roles. They tend to be damsel in distress roles where you don't get meaningful development of women as independent people with independent reasons for doing things that you do with men. That is harmful to the portrayal of women. It's principally harmful for reasons of reclamation. But even if you were to accept that these portrayals were likely to be bad, when the feminist movement supports them, we can make them better. So regardless of where you stand on the issue of whether these are good portrayals or not, feminist movement support is crucial in order to improve them and make them better and more accessible. I'm going to do three things in this speech. First, some points of setup. Then I'm going to explain why this representation is likely to be good. And finally, I'll explain why the feminist movement support makes that representation better. Very simple case from side affirmative. And setup, three things. Firstly, what do these roles look like? These are roles that are focused around fear. It's a central part of that character. So obviously, a lot of those roles will be villains in movies, but it also includes intimidating characters that are protagonists, right? Or, side characters that the hero must go and talk to. And that could be literally any woman in a position of power, like Miranda Priestly, like part of the reason that she's a popular character is because she is in that position of power. That's the thing that makes her fearful. But importantly, in addition, these tend to be major roles. You can't make a woman something that's super fearful without making them a reasonably significant part of the plot. You're more likely to cast women in those sorts of roles on outside the house. Secondly, what does the feminist movement support looks like? It looks like encouraging women to see this movie. It looks like celebrating the actors in those movies and sort of, posting on social media and stuff that they're good. Obviously, the feminist movement is a decentralized movement, but in whatever little ways it can support the movement, it will. But I would note that although we don't ever criticize the fact that this role exists, you can still influence the portrayal in ways that will make it more positive. You can have a more active role in the production process. You don't have to uncritically support these roles. We just support the existence of these roles and would like to support them in a way that incentives to condemn roles that are blatantly sexist. You don't have to uncritically support those. We would just support them in a way that makes them better. Thirdly, though, this doesn't require a whole bunch of political capital. You don't undermine other causes from the feminist movement. That's firstly just because the actions that are required are very small and easy to do. They don't require much money or popular support. But secondly, it's just from feminist movement support in the movie industry is probably specific to that. It won't influence other things like the pay gap or something else. So first point, good representation. The first thing I'm going to prove in this point is that any representation is a good thing. So regardless of whether movie studios have an incentive to make it in a good way or not, which I'll prove later in this point, we just will prove to you that the fact that this representation is there is good and worthy of support from the feminist movement. The first reason is you are much, much more likely to get more female actors with leading roles in Hollywood. And the underlying mechanism for this is simple. That is, in most major films or, most narratives, there aren't a set number of women, like a women quota that the studio has to meet. But there are specific types of roles that have to be fulfilled in this narrative. That is to say, there will always be some sort of villain. It isn't required whether that villain is a woman or not. So when you open up more of those types of roles that could be accessible by women, or at least could be supported to be by women, that means you're just likely to have more women selected for those roles, right? You'll have an equal number of women or a relatively equal number of women selected for the roles they are currently. But in addition, you get more women selected for these new, scary roles as well. Why is that beneficial that you get more women in those roles? Firstly, because they're able to influence the practices of the industry. They're able to shape those roles in a way that makes them more nuanced because they have an incentive to make it a legitimate and an authentic portrayal. But secondly, they gain notoriety. They gain a fan base. That means they can get other roles in the future that are as beneficial as whatever the negative team wants to talk about. It also just increases your pool of good actresses that have rep that film studios can select from in the future. The second reason any representation is good is because the fact that you have more women on screen normalizes the fact that women can exist in a range of different roles. And I would note that that doesn't have to rely on them being good portrayals, because in the status quo, it's overwhelmingly women are in the same types of roles, and they're overwhelmingly side characters, which means you necessarily just get more development on our side of the house, or just a different range of things that opens people's mind, the fact that they might be complex people as well, if they do have those regressive mindsets. Thirdly, though, you provide alternatives to that damsel in distress narrative. But finally, I would just note that fear in and of itself has a lot of narrative power. It's something that the protagonist must be afraid of. And that means it necessarily provides a lot of impact to this role and the way that it influences the film. But secondly, within this point, we explain that the representation is likely to be done in a positive way. That is for a few reasons. Firstly, movie producers generally care about the wishes of the feminist movement. That is to say, there are lots of women with influential positions in Hollywood, increasingly, but secondly, they're just huge financial incentives to do so. Half of your market, and increasing size of it, are women, and it's also more people are more socially aware and woke nowadays. You get more backlash if you create this role in a way that will be harmful. But secondly, movies just are better and get more people out to watch them when they're done in a nuanced manner, which means films have an incentive to make them nuanced. What is the impact of this material? The first is a principled one. That is, women for too long have been in positions where they are fearful of masculine power. It is important that we let them reclaim that fear by being the very characters that men are afraid of. Secondly, though, they are just good role models to the people who watch that movie, who become inspired, who think that they can be in positions of power and have people fear them too. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But thirdly, people will self-select into watching the films that they enjoy. That is to say, even if some women get a negative aspect of this, this character, they don't have to watch it, right? Those who do really enjoy it can become a dedicated fan. And some women will really relate to that fact because they're not used to identifying with the sort of stereotypes that you might usually get. For all of those reasons, that representation is good. Why then does feminist movement support makes them better? Because regardless of whether you believe these things are good or bad, this point proves that we help them get better in like a completely independent win path for side affirmative. The first thing to outline number of reasons why you can influence these movies if you support them as the feminist movement. The first is you get the fan base of that movie on the side, right? You see Marvel fans who are real, fans of Hera and Thor, and the feminist movement says it's so cool that she was so scary there. Now those fans are more likely to buy into the feminist movement because it's, agreeing with something that they like. Secondly, though, you get women watching the movie, right? Because lots of women are influenced by what the feminist movement said is good or bad. Those people watch the movie, which means more of the movie market is female and women, which means that there are incentives for the studios to cater to them. Thirdly, though, you have prominent fans in the industry and prominent women in the industry and feminists, which can help influence on our side of the house. But finally, you just don't lose your bargaining power immediately. When you criticize this movie, no matter what, that just tells the movie studio that you're never going to be on their side, which means they have no incentive to cater to you. On negative side of the house, you turn fans against the movement and you can't get a nuanced conversation about what happens in that movie because you don't have, feminist women writing articles about that movie, writing articles about how to improve that stuff. The impacts of that are huge because some movies with these characters in them are going to be made on either side of the house. But on their side of the house, they're much more likely to be bad portrayals where studios don't have to care as much about what the feminist movement thinks. And women will also have less of those sorts of rights in the workplace that they get as a result. On our side of the house, you actively make those roles better. That means even if you didn't think they were good in and of themselves, the best way to fix them is by actively engaging with the movies, even if they were harmful. But beyond that, we just prove on our side of the house, you get more of those roles, you get a larger industry, you have more roles that are open to women to go into in the future. For all of those reasons, so proud to affirm.
We thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech. Can we have the first negative speaker to introduce the next case here?
Hi, I'm Kritadnya. No preferred pronouns. I'll start in 15 seconds, but before that, can I get to know if I'm audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, just give me a second. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. What we get from side affirmative is that they intrinsically link strong women to being those fear-mongering women. We'll prove to you why strong women and being those fear-mongers are two completely different things. And being a strong woman and portraying strong women is possible without actually instilling fear among people, right? We'll prove to you why that is a better alternative on our side, which does not give any sort of avenues for change on their side as well. But firstly, on how they portray women as those women who instill fear, right? We characterize this to you in two ways. Firstly, these women who are portrayed as those who actually instill fear are the ones shown as they are rude to their peers. They're shown as someone who looks down on their peers, right? These strong women who are, say, the CEOs of certain companies who are, say, at those positions of power are shown as extremely rude women who are not very considerate in the first place. They're shown as people in certain movies that who are extremely hostile, right? So in movies, they're shown as those villains who can cause physical damage to you. They're shown as someone who can insult the shit out of you without actually being very thoughtful in the first place. These women are shown as being at those positions of power, but at the same time who can cause any sort of physical harm to you. This certainly affects those women who are actually in power in real life, but also those people who are working for that particular women, right? We'll prove to you how this affects. But before that, one more piece of characterization on how impactful movies are, right? And why feminist movement shouldn't be the one who are endorsing such sort of fear-mongering women as strong women in the first place. We tell you that movies and TV shows have a far more outreach and they can influence masses. So when you portray a strong woman as someone who's hostile or someone who's rude or someone you should be afraid of, it affects men and women in general. We tell you that these movies, such as those TV shows that show cops as being powerful, who show cops as those good guys, actually affect people in the whole world, right? Suppose certain shows that show cops as being extremely racist in America, you in India also get to know that there is some sort of racism that exists in these structures. You get to know a lot about a society through these movies and TV shows. We tell you that movies are then the ones that actually shape social narratives, and that's why feminist movement should deter from endorsing any such sort of behavior. Firstly, then they tell you that women who are like these fearful women, the women who are in these positions of power who you should be afraid of end up becoming good role models. We do not agree with this premise, firstly because fear is something that comes with privilege, right? Only when you are at that position of power can you actually exercise this fear-mongering mentality. Secondly, fear is not something that everyday women or women from poorer backgrounds can actually end up doing, right? You cannot, as a woman from an oppressed regime or women in a poorer society, go out actively against and instill fear among those men around you, because then you are directly vulnerable and actually visible to this society that has been trying to oppress you since decades. You come in you become fully visible as someone who's trying to instill some sort of fear, not necessarily because you're a strong woman, but now because you know that strength only comes when you instill fear. We tell you that when feminist movements, which are extremely popular, young girls learn at school, the young girls at colleges learn about feminism at school, they end up actually thinking in a way that fear is the only way to actually gain any sort of control. Women or people start thinking that fear is the only way you can influence masses, is the only way you can control, you can have any sort of control. When you start portraying women in certain positions of power as, say, corporate structures, which these movies do an incredible job in defining, right? Movies make you almost believe that it is true, that is how the corporate society works, or that is how the world in general works. They do an incredible job in order to actually make you believe certain things, right? So when people who are like very gullible and people are not very rational, right? People start believing that this is how women in power structures look like. Women who are at those positions of power are actually rude and someone you should be afraid of. Secondly, why are you afraid of someone who's rude to you, right? Because you think that they can cause some sort of harm to you. You feel threatened by their very presence in the first place, right? You feel as if they are anything that they're doing is directly attacking you, even when it is not related to you in the first place. You start thinking that whatever that person in power is doing is directly causing some sort of harm to you. It is either causing your mental harm, you start taking everything that they say as an insult or something that is like outright to you, or secondly, you think that they have certain resources that can cause some sort of tangible harm to you. That is why these women in movies that are shown as fearmongers do not stand as good role models in the first place. Secondly, we tell you that this is not very accessible to women, right? When this starts becoming a norm, when the only way in order for you to get a major role in a movie is by portraying women as something to be afraid of, and people start buying into that narrative, it becomes almost the fact that you as a woman in say in real life have to resort to some sort of fear mongering mechanism in the first place. You don't We think that it is not very accessible for women. Secondly, how does it impact men, right? Men start feeling threatened. How I explained to you already, how rude people, you're afraid of rude people, or how you think that something that they do is directly harming your mental health or can cause any sort of physical damage to you. We tell you that men also start feeling threatened. Women start looking up to these role models, these women in movies as role models. Firstly, because they think that that is how it should be done. Secondly, they end up becoming disappointed because that is not how the society works, right? Women who are afraid, like people who are afraid of these women, actually don't respect them because they are in positions of power, but rather end up working for them because they're only afraid. There isn't any sort of link between respect and fear that comes, right? Then you start working towards this in real life, you start realizing that it is extremely difficult to live up to these expectations set up in the movie in the first place. Secondly, men will start, when this becomes a norm, men start thinking that those women in power, those women who are part of this feminist movement, are the hostile ones. It then becomes extremely difficult for men to integrate with this feminist movement, when our end goal here in say the feminist movement is to have allies, right? We want men to support women, we want men to actually integrate with the movement. But when men start feeling threatened, when they start seeing that the movement that they are supporting is actually a hostile one, we do not think men are likely to integrate with any sort of any sort of such narrative. We do not think that it is good for the feminist movement, and we do not think it is good for the feminist movement to actually go out and endorse this, because it then ends up harming the feminist movement in general. People look up to these feminist icons. People look up, young girls and women in probably every section of society look up to these women who are in positions of power for as their role models. And these role models then end up portraying as fear mongers or someone who's hostile, then ends up harming the women themselves. For all these reasons, extremely proud to propose.
Right, we thank the speaker for that speech. Can we have the second affirmative speaker to advance the affirmative team's case? Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Just one thing I need to clarify is when I entered the speaking order for our team, I did it incorrectly. I'm speaking second, so Charlie Ryan is speaking second, and Sam Trotter is speaking third. Is that good? All right. Am I audible? Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to note right at the start of the speech that side negative has one win strategy. They claim that these portrayals of women are bad, but importantly, they never prove that they're able to actually stop women from getting these roles and them being portrayed extremely poorly. We alternatively have two clear win strategies. Firstly, we prove to you conclusively that these portrayals just are good. They show women who are powerful and that men fear. And that's a portrayal that firstly appeals to women, but secondly creates positive narratives about women in society. But our second win strategy, which they provide absolutely no response to, is that a certain number of these roles are going to exist on either side. There are going to be women in roles in the role of a villain. And our side is the only one that is able to meaningfully influence what those portrayals looks like. That means because of this complete lack of response from side negative, on their side, you still get women in these roles to some extent. And when that happens, they do things like lean more heavily into sexist stereotypes. They do things like mistreat those actors and underpay those actors because they don't have the backing of the feminist movement. They do things like portray all the kinds of negative stereotypes they talked about in terms of why these roles are bad. So if all you care about is these roles and you believe that they're bad and that we aren't able to win that clash at the end of this debate, you should still give this to side affirmative because we prove that we are able to make these roles better. We're able to mitigate the worst of those harms and make them roles that are going to be empowering towards women. First thing I'm going to do in this speech then is reply to their one and only win strategy. Are these portrayals of women good or bad? The first claim they make is that they are shown to be rude. They look down on their peers. The only way they succeed is they make other people fear them, and therefore they're extremely terrible role models for women. The first issue with this is they say that they can be portrayed badly. And they listed a bunch of examples as to the different ways in which a role like this might be bad, but check your notes. They never give you a single mechanism for why it is likely that they're done in that specific way, which is why you should believe our characterization at will, but why it is likely that they will be done well, and positive examples of garnering fear. Things like Captain Marvel being so powerful that her enemies fear her, or a villain, for example, having so much power and control that even the mighty protagonist still fears their wrath. Those sorts of things are what's likely. What are those mechanisms that we give you? Firstly, we explain that to the extent that the feminist movement has any impact over the film industry, which I know is necessary for the negative case to get any benefits at all, they can use that power that they have over the film industry to ensure that these roles are done well. Secondly, we explain to you that the audience is in large part women, which means that if you include a bunch of sexist stereotypes, you make a bunch of your audience upset and less likely to see your film, which encourages you to do things like create roles that appeal to women. Thirdly, we explain to you that you want the feminist movement to be on your side because if you get their support, you're more likely to get more women seeing those roles because they give you a bunch of free publicity. They talk about how good your character is. And fourthly, we explain that nuanced characters are just more engaging. Stereotypes are overplayed, which is why modern Hollywood is less likely to engage in those kinds of stereotypes and prefers to have good, nuanced, engaging characters. For all of those reasons, off the bat, it's just clearly likely that if you're going to believe either set of characterization, you should believe our characterization as to why they won't just be rude and annoying characters. They're likely to be powerful characters that make other people feel them because they are powerful, because they are empowered and strong women. Second issue with this point, though, is that they don't prove that the alternative wouldn't also be just as bad. Because if it's true that a bunch of sexist stereotypes could be ingrained in this type of role, it's also equally true that those sexist stereotypes could find their ways into the roles that women would get on the alternative. We explained to you at will, it looks like, for example, the types of female roles you would get in Hollywood are now just more likely to be things like the damsel in distress who has no power and is weak and requires a man to save them. Those kinds of roles are clearly far worse. And if it's true that the feminist movement can't make these characters good, it's unclear to us why they would be able to make any other kind of character good. So whether or not you believe that these characters can be portrayed well, it's pretty clear that this is totally symmetrical because in the case of the feminist movement can't make them good, all the other alternative roles that women would get are likely to be just as bad. So they get no benefit there. Second push they have then is that these women are bad role models because they're shown women to be hostile. So this is, and then women would follow in the footsteps and there would be a bad image to portray. Firstly, I would note that this is contingent on the previous point, because if we can prove to you that these portrayals are just unclear that being someone who inspires fear is inherently a bad thing. Look at for example, if you just want to talk about protagonists in general, or male protagonists, for example, all popular, important male protagonists in action films and other kinds of popular films do equally inspire fear. So there's nothing inherently about inspiring fear that makes a character so bad. Actually, there's lots of positive characteristics required in order for you to inspire fear. Things like you need to be powerful, things like you need to be dominate your enemies, things like you need to be like an actual important character in those movies. So it's unclear why it is inherently inspiring fear that means these are necessarily going to be bad characters. Third push they have then is that now women get typecasted. The issue is they never explain to you why they are able to prop a different kind of female main character. We explain to you at will that the likely alternative is to just get less female characters on total. Why is that? Firstly, it's because the number of women that are involved in a movie is only a tiny proportion of whether that movie gets made in the first place. There are lots of other larger influences over whether or not a movie gets greenlighted, which means what you achieve is just now a subset of characters in every movie are less likely to be women, but the other set of characters, the protagonists, don't become any more likely to become women. But secondly, it's because you've wasted a bunch of your political capital denouncing all of these movies where you could have spent that capital campaigning for women to be good in other roles or campaigning for those roles to be better. And thirdly, it's because Hollywood likes to draw on already popular source material. For example, turning popular books into movies, making sequels of already popular films. And the gender makeup of that source material isn't going to change. And it's especially important for women because Hollywood sees it making movies with lots of women in them as a risk. So the movies that are most likely to contain lots of women are ones that have pre-existing popular source material. So on their side, now a bunch of that source material, which does contain women, never gets made. On our side, at least those movies do get made in the first place. We get characters like Dolores Umbridge, whether they get no female characters at all. At the end of that, it's just clear these are good characters. And even if they weren't good characters, the alternative is a different kind of character who's equally bad. So then let's move to the second area of this debate. This is where they have no response and we absolutely run away with things. We explain that when it comes to the number of movies that are going to be made on either side, we influence those roles and make them better, which means if you care about bad portrayals of women, you should vote with side affirmative because we prove why they get better. What are our mechanisms for that? Firstly, we explain that you get more women watching the movies. And if there are more women watching the movies, you are more likely to try and appease to women in your audience, which means you don't lean into negative stereotypes like the ones they point out to you. Secondly, we explain to you that you get fans on your side. For example, if you look at movies like Star Wars or Harry Potter, if the feminist movement is saying those movies with female antagonists should never have been made in the first place, obviously the hardcore fans of those movies don't engage with your movement because you're actively campaigning against the thing that they love and care about. On the alternative, if you say that portrayal is good, we encourage it. We want a sequel of the Star Wars franchise to be made. We want more spin-offs of Harry Potter. That movement is now, that group of fans is far more likely to support your movement. And that massively expands the political capital that you have because now you're not just campaigning under the force of women, but also the much larger pool of the audience in general. Thirdly, we explain to you to get more women in Hollywood. You get women who are in major roles and have influence over the director and the producer and the way that what this role looks like, which means that future films are more likely to be better. You get more women in the pool of people that Hollywood can draw from when they're looking to greenlight a movie, which means other kinds of women, other kinds of female roles are more likely to get greenlighted. And fourthly, we explain that you just don't waste your bargaining power. You don't immediately throw away whether or not the feminist movement is going to support you. A director, when they're producing their film, doesn't care about appeasing the feminist movement because they know no matter what they do, the feminist movement isn't going to support them. On our side, you still have that in question. You still have that bargaining chip of we could not support your movie if we don't make this character well, which means that on this issue, if they have absolutely no substantive material to bring to the table, we absolutely run away from things. We explain that these characters on their side still probably exist to some extent, but they are much, much worse. And those are the kinds of characters that you should care most about because those most sexist portrayals, those worst characters that have the most stereotypes are the one that men watch and are influenced by. They have huge cultural impact. They hurt women in a massive way. We make those movies less common and improve them. For these reasons, very, very proud to affirm.
Right, we thank the second affirmative speaker for that speech. Can we invite the second negative speaker to forward the case for the negative team here?
Yeah, just give me 10 seconds. Am I clearly audible?
Yeah.
Okay, am I clearly audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the first thing I want to clarify is that strong woman characters in movies exist on our side too. Notice the difference. For example, Shuri in Black Panther is an extremely strong character and an integral role to T'Challa, but she's still respected and not feared by anyone absolutely. Fear-mongering is unique to their side, but the portrayal of strong women characters in movies is symmetric and isn't intrinsically linked. So they can't claim that strong women characters can be portrayed only by the fact that every other character in the movie is terrified by them. The problem with opposition is that they try to make huge claims that if the feminist movement does not endorse a movie, then every movie will sort of resort to sexist stereotypes. But that simply is not true. Movies are made anyway. People are going to portray women in whatever way they seem fit, but there are a lot of checks and mechanisms in place. So the reason for why studios won't make bad roles or make extremely sexist roles is because a lot of checking mechanisms exist. What are these? So call outs exist. Social media exists for people to call out and talk about why these roles are so sexist and why people should not go ahead and watch this movie. Film critics exist to go ahead and tell you that these roles are portraying women in the stereotypical sexist manners. News outlets exist to tell you that this is not how women should be portrayed. We are not against women being portrayed as villains or women being portrayed as people who are feared. But the only thing that we are against is that the feminist movement should not support the portrayal of women as the source of fear, simply because of the kind of perception it creates in the minds of women and men when the feminist movement legitimizes this portrayal and says that this is the way for women to be. Firstly, going into a bit of setup about how the portrayal in film sort of affects public perception, especially of women in power. So as a person that goes to the movies regularly, and as a society at large, that the way that we view societal structures is dependent on a lot of narratives that is set by films and media. So a large part of that perception about any group can be positively or negatively influenced by the kind of portrayal shown on a big screen. For example, like my first speaker told you about, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine showing cops as heroes just makes it incredibly hard to defund or penalize the police forces of America, simply because people like the police, they hail them as heroes, even though they're involved in things like racial profiling and police brutality. So the perception in movies is what shapes the narrative around this police force. So it is very true for women being portrayed as sources of fear. This narrative is internalized by both men and women, and it affects how women think that they should behave and how men sort of view women. And the problem is not in whether these movies are made or not. These movies can be made, and it is going to be made on both sides of the house. For example, Captain Marvel is not someone, the enemies fear Captain Marvel. The problem comes in when you're saying that your peers should fear you, the people that work under you should fear you. And that's what the problem comes in when you're telling women and you're telling men that women should be feared, simply because the feminist movement is sort of going on and endorsing these movies. It is not the only thing that Gov tries to tell you is that you get more roles or things that you're stopping sexist roles, but that's simply not true, because the feminist movement is not going to just come in and talking about a movie is not going to make people get more roles. The way for more women to get more roles is for better movies to be made. So for example, it is a lot better for women themselves to go and watch movies like She Said, which is about like how the Harvey Weinstein story broke out and how women work behind that, as opposed to women being sort of portrayed as manic people who take like irrational decisions or who are like very mean and rude towards their students and such, which is what like a character like Dolores Umbridge is. So going on to our constructive, right? So why do common grassroots level individuals get affected by this narrative? And especially because of the fact that the feminist movement tells you that this is how women are supposed to be, or it is okay for you to emulate this sort of behavior. The first thing that we know, it is already difficult for women to get into like positions of power in status quo. And in those positions itself, they have very few role models to look up to, simply because there are structures in place that prevent women from accessing these roles of power. So there are very few people for you to look up to and derive inspiration from. So you need a role model in place to understand what needs to be done and how they made that work. So that looks like watching their TED Talks or going through biodata and stories. So what the movement on our side would do is it would promote and invest in advertising and people and women in power currently talking who have, broken through structures. And we can talk about strong women in the movies, but not about like intimidating and, for people around you to fear you. Those are not the kind of roles that the feminist movement should sort of put their weight behind, right? It is okay for them not to say these roles are bad or denounce them. It is just not okay for them to support it simply because of how people are going to internalize it. We already see that in corporate structures, you are used to not being taken seriously or being ignored and dismissed, and because of the way that men view women in these structures. So once in power, people like women are likely or compelled to go ahead and emulate these individuals. And even if they're not in a position of power, the way they operate in their day-to-day lives is going to sort of replicate these women. And they think that their success is a method to sort of replicate it. So when you have these women in movies being portrayed as scary individuals and given the influence of movies on public perception that we already characterized to you, this means that for a lot of women, aspiring to be in positions of power or use them as to use those characters from movies as role models, because there is a lack of like alternatives. So for example, if you get an opportunity to be at like head some sort of vertical at Google, it is better for the feminist movement to advertise, say, another woman CEO, say Indra Nooyi, who is the PepsiCo, chairman, as opposed to looking and emulating people in Devil Wears Prada. So this means if the feminist movement endorses roles like Devil Wears Prada, it means that they are more likely to emulate them and behave in that way, simply because in the movie it's proven to be a successful method, but we don't know if that's actually true in real life. They'd like to believe it to be true simply because of the tremendous job that the movie industry makes it to seem believable. Like there is a legitimate corporate structure that the woman heads in Devil Wears Prada. So the simplest way is to sort of start behaving like these characters and just like emulate them. And the main impact is that for women itself, people might listen and like do what they're told to do, but you're less liked and you're alienated in the workplace. And if people see you as a person that's difficult to work with, it's less likely for men to sort of go and work for other women or say verticals that are headed by other women, because it will be a gender norm. You'll be seen as terrorizing, and men sort of internalize this behavior and this narrative. And this narrative just benefits them at the point where in status quo, it's largely dominated, men dominate positions of power. So you can't afford to have another gender norm that goes against women. Men talk about how, terrorizing a woman leader is. And at home, when fathers come and talk about these issues, then the way that it's internalized by girls and boys is very different. Like children at the home internalize it and propagate this. This means that girls don't want to be bosses. They don't want to reach that place where people can come and like point their fingers and call them bossy and things like that. So it's a higher chance to become a gender norm because you attribute that behavior to them, which is a very intrinsic quality. So they're just going to link the fact, link it in a certain way. And call it offensive and hurtful. So for all these reasons, proud to propose.
Right, thank you very much. Can we have the third affirmative speaker to end the constructive part of the debate before the replies? For the F, yeah.
His entire negative case relies on the idea that instead of having women who inspire fear, we should simply just support having strong women and strong female characters in films instead. But there are three reasons this push and thus their entire case fails. Firstly, as Will tells you back in setup at first affirmative, the fact that a character is in fact powerful is often enough to make them someone to be feared. The fact that, for example, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Captain Marvel literally has the power of the sun is something that makes a character fearful. It does not necessarily mean that they are evil. It does not necessarily mean you have to get up and endorse everything they do. That is how media literacy works. It's not how the critical consumption of films works. The fact that a character inspires fear is not a reason to think that we must denounce them for simply the fact that they hold a position of power that causes other people to be afraid. The second problem with this claim, though, is that there are, and for reasons that we outline and that the negative team sort of agree with, there are social expectations on women based on the kinds of roles they largely fulfill in films already. They're often typecast into things like being the damsel in distress. They're often typecast as weak or side characters, which means that in any event, if you give a female character power, that is likely to inspire fear from the very men and reactionaries that this negative team points out, which means it is unclear what the actual harm is. And we would suggest, as we tell you right down the bench, it's far better for the feminist movement to get in ahead of that and be able to influence it and make sure that portrayal of females in power is going to be done in a far more nuanced and far more feminist way via the fact that it puts commercial incentives on these films, via the fact that it can influence the production process. But thirdly, I just want to point out, let's assume their best case and assume that all of these women we're supporting are actually just villains. They're straight up bad people. That is not necessarily a bad thing, because fear in movies, in characters, creates compelling narratives. It creates interesting characters. It creates conflict, and it generates discourse about feminism, about gender representation, about the kind of roles that women are capable of fulfilling. You don't have to endorse these characters in order to be able to say, this character did evil things, this character inspired fear. That is something that we can discuss. That is something that can generate further gains for female representation. And as we tell you right from the start of this debate, expand the range of roles that are available to women, that people are comfortable seeing women in right from the start. So this negative team's entire case that we would just have strong women instead, even ignoring what Charlie tells you about the fact that they never prove that this is likely to happen against our structural reasons, is simply not enough for them to win this debate. Their only path to victory is now closed off. Two subsequent questions in this debate. Firstly, are these roles themselves actually good? And I'll go into more detail in terms of rebuttal there. And secondly, how can the feminist movement influence the portrayal of these films on both sides? On whether or not these roles are good, we tell you yes for two very simple reasons. Firstly, we simply say that representation in its own right is an important thing, even if it is not always perfect, even if it is not always done in a way that is 100% sympathetic. We agree with everything these characters have done. Because as the word suggests, it is empowering to see yourself in a position of power, to see somebody on the screen who inspires fear, who is capable of being powerful and thinking, wow, that could be me. I'm no longer limited to side characters or being a damsel in distress. It is positive representation that breaks away from the same old tired stereotypes that we tell you women are currently often, pigeonholed into. And even noting that negative team is just like, well, some women are powerful. True, but not enough. The vast majority of female roles are still subservient to men. We would suggest that this narrative helps break out of that problem. But the second reason we give you as to why these roles are good is one that gets literally almost no engagement at first and second negative, which is that we give you structural reasons this representation is done pretty well, because there are massive commercial incentives when the feminist movement is an important influence in terms of your film, when it is telling women how to engage with this film, when it is generating discourse, but also for the fact that you care as presumably as a filmmaker, a director, about making a good film, which is something that you obviously would incentivize you to make nuanced portrayals, ones that are not tired and sexist, not ones that just pick women as, very one-dimensionally evil. Obviously, in those circumstances, the characterization you should go with is the one from side affirmative. They have three arguments. The first is that these are hostile women. They are bad role models and influencers, and that people will internalize this behavior. Three significant problems with this. Firstly, roles do not have to endorse a character. American Psycho is not saying that Patrick Bateman was a good guy. Midsummer is not saying that the woman who could trick her husband into joining a sex cult was a good person. Clearly, films can be critical. And if movies were only allowed to have heroic characters for people to live up to, God, movies would be incredibly boring. They would be barely meaningful. We obviously don't have to say that the feminist movement should say, Carrie from Carrie murdered all of her classmates. You should also go out and murder all of your classmates. It is clearly a critical piece of art that takes artistic liberties. It is something you can engage in terms of nuance, in terms of themes, in terms of portrayals. Second reason this argument falls is that people obviously consume media critically. It is a work of fiction, and they recognize that, which is why people aren't going to go and watch The Devil Wears Prada and then go out and perfectly emulate Meryl Streep's character, because that would impose significant social consequences if they're just a terrible person to everyone around them and they're constantly being rude and miserable and unpleasant to be about. What is important is not telling them you should be this character, or it's just showing representation that women can in fact be in positions of power, that they can also be bad people, that they can wield power. That in and of itself is a positive message to send, even if the characters themselves are bad. But thirdly, and most importantly, we tell you that this doesn't delete other roles for women that are more positive, that are more heroic, the very strong women that this negative team relies on. Because as we tell you right at the start, this just expands the range of roles that are available to women and adds on to the existing sort of roles that women are capable of being cast in and performing in. So it's not mutually exclusive, and women can self-select is this a role that I would be interested in fulfilling? Is this a film that I would be interested in watching? They can see themselves in those films and make the decisions best for themselves, unlike the comparative this negative team defends, where they have a far more restricted range of options in terms of where to act, what kind of roles they can act for, what kind of films to watch. That is why their first big push fails. The second thing they tell us briefly at first negative, which then gets dropped a bit, was that it's not an accessible narrative for a lot of disprivileged women, and that is a bad thing. But we know that this probably just isn't true, right? People can be powerful even if objectively their situation in life is not important. For instance, there are narratives about a mother's rage and willingness to use force to defend her children that is quite common in a lot of different ranges of media that are pretty universally accessible. There are narratives about female empowerment that don't require you to have like a white collar job editing a New York fashion magazine. But secondly, I just want to note how uncomparative this is. For sure, maybe some of these roles are inaccessible, but the alternative is they are just damsels in distress, or they are just like intergalactic superheroes, which presumably is also pretty inaccessible for like poor women around the world. So clearly that push also fails. The final piece of substantive material they have in this debate is that men will feel more threatened by evil women, which means they're likely to respond badly. First problem with this is that they never mechanize exactly what that looks like, how influential that is, which means you should give it pretty minimal weight in your adjudication. But secondly, I want to note importantly, the problem with the status quo and the way men perceive women is not that they feel threatened by women. It's that they see them as inadequate and weak and barely human, which means they're easier to victimize. They're easier to take advantage of, which means that even if you believe that these portrayals are just one-dimensionally threatening women, that is probably a positive countervailing norm of the existing dominant social narrative that says women are barely people, that their emotions matter less, that they are less powerful than men. So even at their best, that is still a narrative that we are happy to support. Overwhelmingly, these roles are good. Overwhelmingly, they are beneficial in terms of representation, in terms of empowerment, and overwhelmingly, the negative team's harms fall. Final question in this debate, though, is just on the actual influence this feminist movement has in this debate. And I just can't believe how unresponsive the negative team is here. Because as we tell you right from the start of Will's speech, even if you ignore the rest of the debate and you think these characters are currently in some capacity bad, we explain that these movies will still exist and it is far more effective for the feminist movement who have the most vested interest in positive change for women, who have the most capacity to influence that film to be better. It is obviously better if they are, included, have a seat at the table to be able to influence, whether they have a feminist actress who is able to influence, whether they have a feminist audience who is able to reshape the commercial incentives to be more nuanced and they are a better depiction of women. That is something you only get when you opt in. This negative team would have you walk away from those deliberations and leave only the worst sexists in Hollywood to produce films about scary women. That is obviously more likely to amplify all of their harms. For these reasons, these roles are broadly good. They are interpreted well. We are very, very happy to propose.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have the third negative speaker to end the debate before the replies?
Give me 15 seconds. Wait, let me just get my timer. Right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right, panel, like two major questions in this debate, right? Like A, like what the feminist movement would do on either side, and B, like what do strong characters actually do for audience, right? And like, but before I get into that, like I'll just make a couple of clarifications that we've been continually reiterating right from our first piece, right? And like notice how strong women characters are inexclusive to either side, right? Like notice on our side you have characters like Shuri who may not necessarily be the main character in the movie, but like have a very, very large integral role to the movie, right? But notice how they're not necessarily feared because they're not necessarily seen as a person to fear, and like they're not necessarily seen as people who are rude and like things like that, right? Like they're seen as people who are respected in the film, which is to say there's a binary between people who are the characters that are loved and the characters that are necessarily feared by a certain fraction of the audience that necessarily come ahead and watch these kind of movies, right? Something that I'll characterize you later in my speech. But like notice at that point, all their entire argument about things like representation in the movie industry and representation in general falls apart, like because it's inexclusive on both sides. Like notice on our side you still have these women characters going ahead, and like you still have like the feminist movement. Like on our side, what the feminist movement then does is like they either propagate and promote women in positions of power already in like corporates and things like that, like things like people like Michelle Obama, or like strong women in strong characters in movies that like Shuri, like as opposed to Dolores in things like that. Like at that point, we don't claim that the feminist movement will somehow suddenly be alienated from this movie industry in itself. We tell you they prioritize movies that portray strong characters but not fear-mongering women characters in itself, right? Which is to say, you still get things like representation, you still get like women going ahead and wanting to be part of a lot of movies and getting to a lot of roles simply because like considering more and more woke audience, they're fine with even if the women is not necessarily the protagonist and not the main character, you still learn to appreciate their involvement in a certain role, which is to say like the fact that the feminist movement now portrays that film as opposed to another film where you have a fear-mongering character, audiences will necessarily understand these kind of nuances and will still necessarily want to get into movies for women, but also be like get like women watching these kind of movies in itself, right? Like going to the target audience in itself. But what we uniquely do on our side and not their side is where on their side you alienate people who are not already in the movement, right? Like, kind of like noted the feminist movement in this debate has two major objectives. It's like getting more and more support from people like that are outside these movement because they're the kind of people who are actually hard to necessarily convince, right? But also be like pushing the quote unquote right narrative, right? The right being the one that benefits women at grassroots levels who aspire to be in power and improve women's status in general, right? That point, when we tell you that they alienate necessarily, then they necessarily alienate men and other people who necessarily fear this character simply because like in an example itself, when I tell you like in a legitimate movie about a legitimate corporate structure, when you have people at lower levels getting abused by this woman at a higher level, you tell you those kind of the audience that necessarily consumes this kind of information who can relate to those people at lower levels will necessarily fear this kind of individual even in the real life, in reality. Like at that point, I tell you that the fact that this character is now being feared necessarily means that you kind of get these people distant from watching these movies in the first place. At that point, we tell you these people who are likely to not be part of the movement in the first place become that much harder to convince simply because this kind of the feminist movement being portraying this means that they go even further away from the movement. Right? At that point, they necessarily have to tell you why they're okay with alienating a certain section of audience that we would have necessarily achieved with them like getting this like long-term goal of necessarily convincing people and getting more and more women to watch in itself, right? To tell you, we don't alienate a certain target audience on our side, but they necessarily do simply because of this fear mongering that the other people can necessarily relate to as victims, and hence don't necessarily watch this movie when reviews and articles and things like that come out about the movie, right? Like I like notice what do strong characters do to certain audiences, right? Like notice like why is fear mongering back? Because the people, as I've already told you, start to hate this character and start to hate the emulations of this character in real life, right? Like the women who necessarily try to emulate. They already tell you like how these women have these in these movies have these inspiring qualities that makes it even much more likely that they'll necessarily emulate it. We tell you like they'll start behaving like them and they'll start behaving like them in workspaces simply because of the fact that there's a lack of alternatives in the first place, considering that the corporate industry and the corporate culture is dominated by men in power in itself. At that point, I tell you, it's very, very easy to become gendered because the protagonist of that movie and the movie is centered around this woman character, and couple that with the feminist movement pushing this narrative forward, it means that these people are at an all-time high of being alienated from the movement and not ever getting to the movement. At that point, I tell you, it becomes super, super problematic on their side because on their side, they reaffirm negative superstitions. On our side, we'll consider the fact that you may get lesser roles. Right? We tell you that binary is still one on our side, but also it becomes that much harder to convince these people with regressive beliefs who are, because they're not already part of the movement, right? They're much more likely to have regressive beliefs in the first place. At that point, we tell you it affects women in workplaces in itself, where these men who to begin with had regressive beliefs are more affirmed at that point. We tell you at that point it becomes super, super problematic for women to fight for change because rallying up with men in companies becomes that much harder. It becomes harder for them to gain those promotions simply because these men have this kind of the fear and this kind of alienation from them in itself, right? And associating that with the gender norm becomes super problematic, as we've already characterized you. We tell you at that point, like even on our side, we can still influence women to come out simply because the feminist movement is not alienating itself from the movie industry. As opposed, it's just prioritizing one movie over another based on the kind of portrayal that they show, right? We tell you at that point that kind of representation still goes in on our side. And like notice this whole point about representation in itself, which was their main argument, right? I tell you like notice even in a lot of situations, they talk to you right from the first speech about how audiences are becoming more and more woke, but they also talk about how feminist movements have more and more influences and are at an all-time high over directors as opposed to in the past, right? To tell you at that point, considering this frame in itself, like the movie itself is not the most important bit, but the impact it has on grassroots level individuals, grassroots level women aspiring to be in positions of power, and the perception they have right from growing up. When we tell you like fathers will come home and gender a norm of women in workplaces being fearful, we tell you this is the kind of impact that we necessarily want to reach out as the feminist movement, right? At that point, I tell you, like, notice, like, they need to be able to tell us why it's necessary to fearmonger, especially when it could distance people from it, right? And remove a target audience in itself. But like, notice damsels in distress will not necessarily exist on our side as well because of the fact that feminist movement has exerting more and more influence over the film industry itself, which means these roles are getting lesser and lesser day by day in itself, right? But also they need to be able to, at that point, they need to be able to prove why this process on their side uniquely accelerates this to have any kind of significance in this debate, right? Something that they've not necessarily done to you in this debate at all. Like panel, like notice how it's worse to have women characters reinforcing negative stereotypes as opposed to not portraying at all, which is our worst case, right? Where you don't have women in any kind of roles in itself. But also notice like how on their side, the women, there are very, very select few roles in itself, right? By the definition of the role being protagonist in itself. So either it's symmetric where you have more women getting into the film industry and more women watching in itself, or their argument about their whole argument about more women getting on only uniquely on their side is flawed, right? But notice their entire debate is about feminist movement supporting negative stereotypes, right? However, the debate is simply about how you show strength alongside fear. They tell you that fear would exist, but in a good way. But we told you already that fear can be instilled, and that cannot necessarily happen in a good way, right? Where men kind of internalize this fear in workplaces, in households, and in like society in general, right? And it becomes commonplace in discussions and things like that. And we tell you how it becomes super, super detrimental for commonplace individuals that are women. And for all these reasons, really, really proud to post.
All right, thank you. Can we have the negatives reply speaker to end the debate for the next here?
Yeah, just give me 10 seconds. Okay, am I audible? Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the first thing that we need to talk about in this debate is look at Captain Marvel, which was an example that was used by both teams. Government team comes and tells us that Captain Marvel inspires fear in her enemies, which is why she should be a role model, which is why she should be feared. And we completely agree with that. It is okay for Captain Marvel to inspire fear in her enemies and people who are actively going to harm her, but it is bad for her to come and intimidate people who are her subordinates, people who she works with. And it is important for the feminist movement not to associate with itself with promoting characters that could be antagonizing towards their peers, towards the people that they will have to work with. This is the main binary in this debate. We are not against the roles that would show a woman as a little more intimidating, a little more antagonizing, but we've already linked to you how the way that narratives are brought about in society by what the kind of movies that are made. And it is all the more intensified by the way that when feminist movements come in and support these roles and they come and endorse these roles, it tells women that they should sort of emulate this, or this is the right way for them to behave. And it also creates an image in men's minds about how women are actually going to come and behave with them, or it just enforces a lot more negative stereotypes that could already exist in men, and it could just lead to not having enough buy-in into the feminist movement. And this does not necessarily affect the film industry in a way that roles become lesser or you get less progressive roles, simply because people are woke enough now. Women simply won't go in and watch movies that are inherently sexist and be influenced by those movies, simply because you have a lot of narratives around you, like social media, like the news, like film criticism and things like that, telling you why a movie is particularly problematic. The problem comes in when it is okay for the feminist movement to go in and support these sort of fear-mongering roles. These roles can exist independently and they aren't going to be taken away simply because there are people that want to watch these movies. There are women who want to play these roles, and no one is telling those women not to play these roles. We are just not going ahead and actively supporting them. We've told you how, the main thing that the government comes and tries to tell you is that any representation is fine. But that's the most problematic thing, is because even if you cannot have good representation, a bad representation sort of just enforces the negative stereotypes. It just allows people to look at you in a certain way and the main factor that sort of determines how strongly a movie is going to affect people who are watching it is if the feminist movement goes ahead and supports the views that are propagated by that movie, or if the feminist movement is supporting the particular characters that come out of that movie. That's where the link sort of comes in, where that is what sort of affects grassroots level individuals in the way that they behave, or in the way that people around them are going to start interacting with them. Because it tells you that simply because the feminist movement is endorsing these roles, it means that is the way that a woman is supposed to behave in order to get things done, in order to make yourself heard. And it also creates a negative impact in in the mind of men, and just it enforces those negative stereotypes that you have about women already, and you have a negative you get negative perception about the feminist movement in general simply because they're going ahead and supporting women that are seen as antagonizing towards the general public at large. So for all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you. Can we have the affirmatives reply to end the debate here?
People who liked the Joker don't believe that you should shoot people on trains. People who like Voldemort wouldn't support murdering children. This negative team's case relies on audiences seeing a woman as a source of fear and deciding that then all women must be evil. It is clearly not the way that people interact with media. Their characterization just isn't believable. I'm going to ask 3 questions in the reply. Firstly, what does the source of fear look like? Secondly, are these roles generally good or generally bad? And finally, independent of that, what is the effect of the feminist movement supporting them? The negative team says, and what the characterization looks like, that it's not just being powerful, it's not just being villains, it's something worse than that. We give a few points of response. The first is right down our bench. We explain why it's substantially more likely that you'll be a woman who is feared if you're a woman who is powerful, or woman, because any power inspires fear. And here, even their examples are wrong, right? Like Black Panther 2 is all about Shuri going on a revenge arc. But secondly, and more importantly, we explain that even if that isn't true, fear specifically is a super powerful narrative tool that is really important that women are able to access. And I would note that if you buy our characterization here, it is just a clear landslide win for affirmative. But unlike negative team, I'm going to take them at their best and explain why even if you don't believe any of that, we still come away with a clear victory in this debate. So, are the roles good or bad? The negative case is essentially a bunch of assertions, such as men will watch these roles and decide that they're scared of all women, or women will feel like this is the only way to succeed. These are wrong for a number of reasons that we outlined down the bench. The first is that, as I say in my introduction, it requires you to believe that everyone watches these pieces of media entirely uncritically. The second is we explain that it's not a zero-sum game. Because of our analysis about how movie producers choose these roles, this role doesn't come at the expense of other roles that women would have. Thirdly, we give structural reasons why the roles are likely to be made in a nuanced way. And it's only at third negative where we get the response that, well, maybe the film industry is dominated by men, to which we say increasingly less so, as I set up at first affirmative, but also that that's in tension with their argument against damsels in distress narratives, where they say that there's increasing support for the feminist movement in Hollywood. They have to pick one or the other. But fourth, we explain even if these portrayals are not good portrayals, we outline a set of benefits of just having that representation there. That is like the principal benefit of reclaiming those narratives of fear. But finally, we explain that people can choose to watch the movies that they like. So even if only some people think this is a good thing that they support watching, it's better to increase the wideness of representation so that those people can opt into those movies and watch the things that they will enjoy. So on the, a huge balance of probabilities, we just think that most of these roles tend to be good, tend to be nuanced. We outline a range of reasons why that is true. But we outline a completely independent win strategy. And that is what this debate really is about, which is the effect of the feminist movement supporting it. What does negative team say? They say, well, supporting it means you're endorsing it. You're endorsing privilege. You're endorsing cops. You're endorsing an abuse of power. But endorsing an existence of a character does not mean endorsing their actions. Secondly, negative team says, well, you can critique it as well on negative team side without ever engaging with our mechanisms why you're better able to do that on affirmative. And finally, they say, well, you will alienate people. But that is, of course, contingent on, firstly, these being bad portrayals, and secondly, people 100% internalizing the entire movie. Let's be clear about what our case was at this point, just extending the margins. Because we tell you the feminist movement support makes the roles better, regardless of whether you believe they are good or bad. And we know that you can support it in a critical way. And that has 4 key reasons that we outline at first and second to no individual response. That is that you get fans on board with the feminist movement, that you get more women to watch the movie and influence, the money incentives of producers, that you have more women in Hollywood who can directly influence things like casting decisions, and finally, that you don't just lose all your bargaining power when you throw it all out the window and always regret this movie. This is an independent win strategy, because even if you believe that they're bad, at least on our side of the house, you actually get a nuanced portrayal, because on their side, you always get some portrayal, but it will be the most sexist. It will cop all of the harms that they want to say will exist on our side.
All right, thank you all speakers for that debate. I'm going to stop the recording, and you may just leave the room now so that the panel can decide.